What's up, wizards? Welcome back to Across the Horizon. So we are now on episode 4 or 5, 5, and we're covering also Aphorism 5. I believe
Have
that's
we
where
caught
we're
up?
at.
Have we caught up? Because it was
We
like we had number one was the intro, and then we were like one behind. So did we like catch up
Yes, because we did 3 and 4
in
last time.
one? Oh, well, there you go.
So
That's a good.
so
Now what? Five is five.
5 is
We don't
5.
have that confusion anymore. Well, that's great.
Exactly.
The less confusion, the better.
Always. So do you want me to read this one, or would you like to read this one?
Yeah. Why don't you read the Ashman, and then I'll read the Partridge.
Okay, give me a second, and I will have to shuffle my papers because I'm old school and print everything.
Really, I'm the
So
old one. I'm on the computer, so I was just looking at my website.
everyone gives me crap for writing everything. It's okay.
It's okay.
I'm so I have the Ashman one up right here. A skillful person, acquainted with the nature of the stars, is enabled to avert many of their effects and to prepare himself for those effects before they arrive.
Yeah, and the Partridge is pretty similar. It says, one skillful in this science may evade many effects of the stars when he knows their nature, and diligent prepares himself to receive their effects. Okay.
So, I mean, to me, this kind of is saying, hey, if you understand the way of the stars, you can avoid bad things. And that's kind of a interesting take, but I'm not sure if fate works that way. But I'll
I know. I
totally
was
give
gonna
you a
say.
response.
What I would say about this one is that this is like a potentiality, right? What this is saying is that if you were a person who knew the nature of the stars, right, and not only knew the nature of the stars sort of in general, but knew their current nature, right, and what they were predicting currently, then you could do that. So I think it's a true statement. Just like I just don't think it's possible to do it very easily. I mean, I said, we are able to, if you think of a horary question, right, you have a very specific question, right? You have the chart, and then you can look at that, and you can, if you're really good at it and really on the ball that day, you can make a reasonably accurate prediction, right? So to me, a horary is sort of like a flashlight, right? Or like a laser beam. It's like you go into this totally dark room and you've got a flashlight and you point the flashlight, right? So you can illuminate that one, section pretty well, right? But that's it. And the rest of it, it's dark, right? So yeah, with horary, if someone has a specific question that they care about and it's answerable by horary, and they ask the question and you're good at it, you can answer it. But you're getting this very narrow thing, right? What people would like, and I get a certain amount of clients that come to me and they'll say, okay, tell me everything that's going to happen in the next 6 months. And it's like the expectation is that, well, if this works, it'll tell me every single thing in detail, and you'll be able to tell me everything that happened. So 5 days and 3 hours from now, then Bob is going to call you up, that sort of thing. So I think that that's the problem, is that this holds out the sort of glittering prospect, which I think is correct, right? Because I think, again, the stellar cycles, they're very obvious. You can go 10,000 years in the past, 10,000 years in the future, and you can see exactly where the position of the planets are and everything. And those do accurately reflect a section of, the underlying spiritual cycles. But boy, the devil's in the details in terms of like, taking and looking at the stellar cycles and then predicting what's happening on Earth. So I think that's what I would say about that, is that I think that as a practical matter, actually be able to do that. The other thing I think that you're kind of pointing to with the fate stuff is like, how much really can we avoid fate? You know what I mean? I think people really, like modern people, really hate the idea of fate because they think of it as like this negative outside force forcing you to do stuff you don't want or stopping you from getting what you want. And it's like, really the attraction of it is like, because people will come to me again, they'll be like, well, if I get a talisman or I do an election, can I just get rid of that negative indications of my chart? I don't like this part of my chart, so can I basically do chart surgery? And again, it's like, I don't think so. I mean, to me, it's really like the chart is who you are. So it's like an acorn that doesn't want to be an oak. I'd rather be a pine tree. It's like, and I don't, and in that case, you just like, I'm sorry. It's disappointing to people, but it's like, I mean, you are what you are. And I mean, you certainly can work on ameliorating things. I mean, for me, a good example is I have Mars and Leo, and I have a terrible temper. And it's like over the years, I've certainly with a lot of effort, and praying and, all sorts of stuff, spiritual knowledge and maybe wearing out and getting old. It's not as bad as it used to be, but I don't think to my dying day that I'm ever going to be mellow and relaxed 100% of the time. You know what I mean? It's like, that's who I am. And, I may not like it at times. Other people may not like it at times, but it's just that's sort of the reality of it. It doesn't mean it's absolutely set in stone though either. I mean, there's a certain amount of flex, but I think that I think your insight is correct that this is, probably not something that's, because I think people would look at that and say, oh, great, then I can just get whatever I want. I can overthrow fate, my chart, whatever really easily. And it's like, it takes a lot of wisdom. The sage could do this to a certain extent. But then if you're a sage, why would you want to change anything? I mean, when you're really wise, you understand the nature of reality is such that it's perfect. Like, how can you say it's perfect? Death and destruction. But it's like it is part of the whole. Everything does fit together appropriately. So I think that's an interesting, like I say, interesting possibility, but not as glittering a prospect as it might first appear to be.
Well, I think at first blush, it really looks like, okay, I can fully prevent all the bad things from ever happening from happening. Right. And that's kind of where I think that it doesn't quite fit, but it kind of does. So I'll go ahead and push back a little bit so that we kind of have a little bit more balance on this. So the way that it could work though is if you're able to spot trends and okay, well, this is going to be an awful time for me to take out a loan, don't take out a loan during that period. I mean, it just the little things like that. And that also plays into the horary that you were discussing, because if you can kind of see the direction that the horary is going, you can make very solid judgments about very specific slices of time, and you can respond to that. But to say, okay, well, I don't want anything bad to happen to me for the whole next 6 months, that would be like asking me as a computer science professional to say, okay, I don't, under no circumstances do I want to be infected by any virus over the next 6 months. And so we're like, okay, great. Well, if we want to do that, you're going to have to pay me a whole bunch, and I'm going to have a full team. And what we're going to have to do is sit there and watch every single process that happens on your system for the entire time. And I don't think that that's very cost effective for you. And you could make an argument you could do that with astrology. I'm not so sure you could, because bad things are still going to happen. We're still bound by mortality. We're still bound by being in the world as it is. So, like, you're not going to be able to fly. You're not going to be able to become this super immortal because you have a talisman or anything like that, but or gain any other superpowers. But you can kind of wiggle things like, okay, well, I want to refinance my house. When's a good time to do that? When's a good time to avoid that? Like, if you have to say, okay, well, there aren't any good times, but this is the absolute worst time, so don't do it now. So I can see that working.
I like the weather analogy. I mean, obviously, if it looks like it's going to rain tomorrow, maybe you don't want to schedule a picnic. That's one of those things of like, but I'm not big on transits or whatever. I mean, I'm not a big natal timing fan. I mean, I don't deny that it's possible. I just haven't seen anybody that's able to, because I've seen a lot of people looking at Hitler's chart and say, oh, look, 1944, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, that's a big difference between predicting and what's to come. You know what I mean? And also this sort of vague stuff. I mean, on the other hand, like Pluto transits, I'm like, what I've noticed with that, with myself, when I used to look at that, was that usually it would accurately reflect my emotional state. So there might not have been anything concrete happening, but boy, every time they got the negative, square opposition of Pluto, then yeah, I was definitely having a bad time emotionally. So, it's never, it's interesting because if you play blackjack, if you're in a really good casino, the house odds against you maybe be 1, 2, 3%, right? But with that 1, 2, or 3%, they can win all your money. And if you count cards, right, you got a 1, 2, 3% advantage on the casino, and they'll throw you out for that. So you might sneer at, oh, 1% advantage, or what's the point of that? It's like, no, that's really helpful. So, and I think astrology and astrological magic can do even better than that. But it's just one of those things. It's like, I think that what an astrologer really is a master of, just like you said, the flex, right? And you can look at a situation and say, how much flex is there here? How much, and then, okay, what maybe can I do about it? But I just think that the expectation is like Harry Potter, and electromagnetic, big bolts or something, and, this techno thing, and I can just get whatever I want. It's like, no, it's more like we're going to get to this aphorism of like gardening, and that's not very exciting, but hey, I mean, gardening, that's how everyone eats, it's really quite powerful. So I think that that's a lot of what we're getting into, these issues about sort of the traditional view of fate. The other thing I would say is about bad stuff is that, I mean, for example, my first job, I was with the government. I hated it, but I wouldn't quit. And I ended up basically getting forced to quit or get fired. They came to me and said, on the last day of my probationary period, either you quit or we'll fire you. I was devastated, but boy, I hated that job. And that set me off on this whole future of great stuff. So looking back, I'm like, I'm glad that happened. At the time, it was awful. So it's a little hard, again, to characterize whether this is good or bad, And then when we're just talking from a personal standpoint, how about a much larger, bigger perspective of it, And it's sort of like, I think that there's this idea of providence, which is interesting. It's different than fate. Fate is sort of like, like blind fate, or fate's forcing you to do stuff, or fate's kind of malevolent. There's a sense of that. Providence is, look, everything fits together. Everything, that it maybe appears to be negative, it actually for a good purpose, And like I said, World War II was terrible, but it ended colonialism. It broke the hold of the colonial powers over the rest of the world, and all the other countries became free after World War II, even though it was devastating and everything like that. So I mean, you can look and say, you got to clear the field out before you can have new crops. You can think of all these different ideas about it. So I think it points to a lot of interesting ideas about fate, providence, and that's really what we deal with as astrologers. I mean, really, that's our job, is to look at fate and then to say, okay, how much flex is in a situation? I mean, you're not gonna be able to change this, I don't think, but yeah, maybe you could do this. So there is a lot of useful stuff that can be done astrologically, even if you can't come in and change everything and get exactly what you want.
And how do you, so I'm going to totally take a step into the practical with that. How do you set client expectations as to that reality, since it does play into part of what we're doing here is figuring out the practical use of some of these things. And since we know the limitations of astrology, how do we set that expectation?
Well, for example, I mean, I had someone today email me and say, and this is the classic way they formulate it, is, when will my house sell? See, there's not a question of it selling. Of course it's going to sell. It has to sell. It would be, it must happen. What I want to happen must happen. But is it going to be next week or 3 weeks? So that's the kind of mindset with that. And so I come back and I said, look, there's always possible to have a negative answer and a positive answer with the horary. So when you ask, when will my house sell? You're really asking, will my house sell? And if so, when, right? And also typically with the horary that I do, it's only really looking at about a year. I mean, there's a lot of weird things that can come about. That's what I would say. So you say, well, you need to ask a yes or no question, and it needs to be something that's going to happen in the next year, right? It needs to be concrete. Like relationships, they'll say, well, does he love me? I'm like, I'm not going to be able to tell that. Will you have a committed relationship? Yeah, I can see that pretty clearly in the chart. So a lot of it with horary, I started to basically now ask people to send me the question first, right? And that's helpful too, because I can help them formulate the question. But a lot of the thing about horary is getting yourself till you're ready to ask the horary. There's a tendency for people to want to let the astrology do the work for them, and say, what should I do with the rest of my life, as a question. And that's why formulating it as a yes or no, it's much more focused. And so, a lot of it is, the more you do this, the more you get a sense of what people are looking for, and then how to, basically to get people in the right area, or even to not do questions that are inappropriate. It's one of those things of it's I've occasionally with horary will turn people away, because I'm like, that's not an answerable question. Usually because they're too early in the process. Like I said, that they're like, there's 20 places I can move to. Which of these 20 places should I move to? I'm like, you need to go through your decision-making process and get to where the final answer would be best. And this thing of, I'll ask about 1, and they'll ask about 2, ask about 3, ask about 4. I'm like, you could do that, but the precision, is not so great with it. Or another one I had today, someone was like, wanted to know about a partnership, right? So should I go into this partnership? So I did it as a horary. And so they got the answer to that back. And then they're like, oh, could you do a natal relationship thing with a partner? I'm like, no, because I'm like, the horary is the best for that. Plus, I don't, I have a better sense of the dynamic of a natal chart, because what I have a reading where I'll look at the horary for the relationship and then the two natal charts of the people involved. And it's very interesting to see that perspective. But the horary really tells you what's going to happen. So a lot of it there is just sort of like explaining stuff to people clearly, and then also being clear about what you can and can't do, and what you think is accurate and what's not accurate. I mean, for example, lost items, those are hard questions to do. I mean, because the answer might be really the root question there is, will I get the thing back? Right. But what they're interested in is, where is it? I mean, it's got to be somewhere, right? So tell me where it is. And it's like the answer, the horary might be, oh, you're not going to get the item back. So you need to be upfront with people about that. And also, where is it? It's like, well, it's not too far away, rocky wooded slope. That's like, they're looking for, it's 515 South Street buried under the, under the blue box kind of thing. And you're like, what you're able to do is, so that's a lot of it is just being straight up with people about the accuracy. Or, like I said, if someone says, I want a natal reading and I want you to tell me if I'm going to have a relationship with this particular person, I'd be like, no, you need a horary. It's really fitting them to the right stuff and just being straight up about it. But I have to do a lot of managing of expectations. I mean, talismans particularly. I mean, I have a disclaimer on every single page with a talisman saying, we don't know what the results are going to be for you. You know what I mean? It's like, there's no way to predict what's going to happen. And like I said, a lot of people are happy, but some people are not. So you just need to be ready for that if you're gonna get a talisman. And if somebody comes to me and says, I want to win the lottery, which talisman should I get? I say, don't buy a talisman. That's just right there. It's just like, no, I'm not gonna feed that view. And I don't want you to, I'd rather not make the sale than have a dissatisfied customer. So that's just, a lot of it is, and are just explaining stuff to people. I mean, you've got some people that are sophisticated spiritually or magically, because maybe they have a family tradition or something like that. But a lot of people, their experience is Harry Potter. And so that's what their expectation is. And that's just not, it's real. And because it's real, it's not going to be able to be instantaneous, or, it's not going to instantly, it's not magical. Real magic is not magic.
Right. And I think that you also touched on it a lot whenever you were talking about blackjack. And if you're able to throw the winning trend by 1 to 2%, it really changes your the power dynamics between the house and the players. And
but I think it can be even more powerful. Let me tell you, I got an email today, and this guy said, I was in New York, and he said, I went to this metaphysical shop, and he said, I noticed that they were printing out labels, right, for candles, like planetary hour or something like that, like planetary. And he said they were just slapping them on the candle. He says, I thought that was really weird. He said, so I had my Mercury talisman with me. So he said, I got it out. He said, I just did this little kind of mini invocation of Mercury. And I said, what's going on here? Is this like legit? And all of a sudden, he said, their printer system just froze up, and it refused to print any more labels except Mercury. I was like, "Ooh, that's a good story." So I like it a lot. Yeah, I said, "Can I use this as a testimonial?" But I'm like, "See, that's a really quick invocation, that because I think who knows what was going on, but it sounded like they were just slapping the labels on. They weren't doing any kind of invocation or doing any, you know what I mean? They were just selling this thing. It was like planetary without anything at all, and so maybe Mercury wasn't too happy about that." So, but with that sort of stuff, it's like that's a cool. I mean, that's a direct. You've got. I did the invocation. I had an appropriate result, right, immediately. So it's like that's something that I was like, I take that a little more seriously. It's a good story too, but then that's more than just 1 or 2%, right? That's actually like a pretty strong, noticeable, coherent, appropriate effect, and so, but it's not controllable. It's not like that's what I would say about it, is that he didn't know it was going to happen, and he wasn't really in control of it when it did. But it's sort of like, I think that's Mercury in action.
Cool. Well, I guess we'll be back next week.